The morning sun spilled across the glass walls of the Carter MedTech boardroom, catching the edges of the city skyline like shards of silver. I smoothed the sleeve of my navy blazer, a habit I picked up from my father, and entered with my laptop tucked under one arm, ready to discuss quarterly performance and the new clinical trial schedule. It should have been a routine meeting. Richard Hale sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my father's seat. His smile was thin, a razor waiting to cut. Around him, the board members whispered in a hush that felt rehearsed. I nodded politely and set up my laptop, but the room's air was thick, and a chill ran through me even in the warm light. "Elena," Richard began, his voice heavy with false sympathy, "before we move to the agenda, there's a sensitive matter to address." I straightened in my chair. "Of course." He folded his hands. "We've received credible reports that you've been leaking proprietary information to Apex Biotech, confidential data about our immunotherapy protocols." A murmur rippled across the table. My throat went dry. "That's absurd. I've done nothing of the sort." Richard's expression hardened. "The board takes this seriously. A vote has been conducted, effective immediately. You are removed from your position as COO. Security will escort you from the premises." I felt the blood drain from my face as the words sank in. A few board members avoided my eyes. Others, like Marjorie Quell, watched with the faintest smirk, as though savoring the scene. Two security guards stepped into the room, their polished shoes clicking on the marble floor. One of them extended a hand. "Your badge, Mr. Carter." Humiliation scorched my skin. My father had built this company from nothing, and now I was being paraded out like a criminal. I unclipped the badge from my jacket, feeling the weight of the stairs. The second guard opened my bag and rifled through it in front of the board, pulling out my notebook and pens before nodding that it was clear. I forced my face into calm as they escorted me down the hall. Employees glanced up from their desks, eyes widening. Whispers followed me to the elevator. Each step etched the humiliation deeper, but beneath the burn of shame, something harder took shape, a cold, clean edge of resolve. By the time the elevator doors closed, the ember of fury inside me had become a steady flame, and I knew that leaving this building was only the first move in a much larger game. By the time I reached Oakland Cemetery, dusk had settled like a heavy coat over the city. The last streaks of sun bled across the horizon, catching on the wet leaves as I parked beneath the old oak tree near my father's grave. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, and rain misted the windshield, blurring the world into muted grays and golds. I sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the polished granite that bore his name, Dr. Nathaniel Carter. Seeing it carved in stone still felt like a mistake, as if I could blink and find him in the lab, hunched over his microscope with a coffee going cold at his elbow. My earliest memories came rushing back, playing hide and seek between lab benches, the smell of ethanol and fresh coffee in the air, my father's voice patient as he explained the difference between a centrifuge and an incubator to his curious little girl. He never treated me like a child in his world. "You can't lead what you don't understand." "Elena," he'd say, eyes crinkling behind his glasses. "Real leadership is quiet and patient win in the shadows first." The words echoed now, cutting through the humiliation that still burned from the boardroom. I let my forehead rest against the steering wheel, and for the first time since Richard's announcement, tears slipped free. They tracked down my cheeks, mingling with the rhythm of rain tapping the roof. For a brief, bitter moment, doubt seeped in. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just the founder's daughter. Someone to humor in the lab and discard in the boardroom. My chest tightened, and I gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. But grief carries its own kind of clarity. The company my father built was more than stock and buildings, it was patients saved, research breakthroughs, the lives changed by his work. Letting them strip it for parts would be a betrayal far deeper than what they had done to me. I wiped my face, straightened in the driver's seat, and let resolve settle in my bones. I would protect his legacy, even if I had to fight in silence and in shadows. And if they believed I was gone, they would never see me coming. The morning after my visit to the cemetery, I sat at the small kitchen table in my loft, staring at the steam rising from a mug of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. The humiliation from the boardroom still clung to my skin, but beneath it, something colder had settled. Resolve, hardened by grief. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number my college roommate had given me years ago, half joking that I'd never need it unless my life exploded. Liam Rourke, a voice answered, low and unhurried. I need someone to dig quietly. I said, corporate board members, financial records, and I need it yesterday. He didn't ask why. He simply said, text me the names. 3 days later, he handed me a flash drive over a cup of burned coffee in a dingy diner near the wharf. You didn't hear this from me, he said before disappearing into the gray morning. That night, I sat cross-legged on my living room floor, my laptop casting a cold glow over stacks of notes. The first folder I opened made my stomach twist. Wire transfers, stock sales, and contracts all linked to shell companies, most under the name of Richard's wife. A few were even routed through trusts with laughably generic names, Civic Health Partners and Urban Renewal Holdings. The emails were worse. Marjorie Quell, the woman who once gave me a necklace for my Harvard graduation, had written, once Apex finalizes the acquisition, we'll have liquid exits within 60 days. Don't worry about Elena Richard has that handled. I scrolled through message after message until the narrative was undeniable. They weren't just pushing me out, they were dismantling my father's life's work for profit. Carter MedTech's core research, the immunotherapy protocols that could save thousands of lives, was to be sold to Apex Biotech. The treatments would vanish into patent vaults, released only when they maximized profit. My chest burned. But this time, it wasn't grief. It was precision. Cut rage. They wanted me gone so they could strip the company bare. I closed my laptop and stared at the city lights beyond my window. I would fight them my way, in silence and in shadows. And when I struck, they would never recover. I spent the next morning at my father's old desk, the one I'd salvaged from storage after the board purged his office. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the leather portfolio holding the last of my inheritance savings. He had set aside for opportunities worth risking everything. If protecting Carter MedTech wasn't that, nothing ever would be. The first step was creating distance. I registered 3 shell LLCs in Delaware, each with names bland enough to lull any analyst to sleep. Harborline Ventures, Blue Oak Holdings, and Westerly Capital Partners. Liam's contact at a boutique law firm handled the paperwork without asking a single question, and within a week, I had vehicles to start accumulating shares. By day, I became a ghost moving through the city quiet cafes in the financial district, a corner table in a library reading room, dim parking lots where I met small shareholders after hours. Most were longtime employees, people who remembered the days when my father walked the factory floor in a lab coat. Their eyes softened when I told them the truth in low, steady tones. Richard and the board were selling out the company. Will my shares even make a difference? One technician asked as he signed the proxy form with trembling fingers. Every voice matters, I said, especially now. Back at my loft, the transformation was complete. Whiteboards lined the walls, covered with flowcharts and sticky notes. Each shareholder's name, stake percentage, and status: green for committed, yellow for possible, red for hostile, filled the room like a battle map. At night, I lay on the couch, lit only by my laptop and the city glow bleeding through the blinds. Calculating routes to 75% ownership, sleep became a memory. Meals were coffee and takeout boxes stacked on the counter. The only sound was the low hum of the fridge and the occasional buzz of my phone with a new lead. Isolation pressed on me, cold and relentless, but it was the price of the war I had chosen. By the end of the third week, the map on my wall was speckled with green, the first shape of an army forming in the shadows. And just as I began to feel the smallest spark of momentum, an unexpected call came that would test my fragile network. Dr. Sandra Kim met me at a quiet corner booth of a cafe 2 blocks from the hospital. Her lab coat was folded over one arm, and her eyes darted toward the windows as if she expected Richard himself to appear. When I explained the Apex deal and the board's plans to bury our immunotherapy protocols, her jaw tightened. "They'll lock the research away and release it only when it's profitable," I said, leaning forward. "Everything you've worked for, everything my father fought for will vanish." She exhaled slowly, the steam from her tea curling upward. "I owe your father my career. When I was blacklisted for whistleblowing, he hired me without a second thought." She reached into her bag and slid over a thin folder. 2% in stock options. "They're yours. I'll make calls to the others in R&D. They need to know the truth," with Sandra on board. The tide shifted. In the following days, I met employees in hushed tones at bus stops, in parking garages, behind the lab building where the security cameras didn't reach. Shock and anger flashed across their faces as I shared proof of the board's betrayal. Slowly, they added their fractions of ownership to my growing coalition, and for the first time, I felt the momentum of something bigger than myself. Then the first fracture appeared. Liam called one evening, his voice sharp. "You've got a leak. Richard knows you met with 3 lab techs yesterday. He's asking questions." My stomach dropped. I replayed the conversations in my mind, and the image of Evan, a young technician I'd known since his internship, surfaced. He'd seemed eager, even proud, to be part of my plan. My chest tightened with the bitter taste of betrayal. I canceled 2 planned meetings and spent the next week moving like a shadow, double-checking every approach, every name. My trust narrowed to a pinpoint, and even the green markers on my wall felt fragile. By the end of the week, the paranoia had become a steady companion, whispering in every silence. Yet the map on my wall continued to grow greener, and with each new ally, the stakes rose higher. One misstep now could destroy everything. The idea came to me one sleepless night as I stared at the war map on my loft wall, the green and yellow markers reflecting in the dark window. Richard and the board were watching for me to crawl away or make a desperate mistake. I would give them a shadow to chase. Within 48 hours, Prometheus Biotech LLC existed on paper, registered in Delaware with a website that looked just real enough. A single page showcased a clean logo, a vague mission statement about next-generation oncology solutions, and a contact email routed to a burner account. Then I went to work feeding the story. I scheduled casual lunches with Carter's top scientists at popular cafes, always at tables near windows. I let the right people see me walking out of a co-working space downtown. I even posted a cryptic LinkedIn update, excited about new horizons in immunotherapy research. More soon. The effect was immediate. By the end of the week, Liam called with a grin in his voice, "The market thinks you're poaching their crown jewels. Carter MedTech stock is sliding. Small investors are dumping shares like hot potatoes." I moved fast through my shell companies. I scooped up every available share. Each one felt like a silent victory, another brick in the wall of control I was building. By the time the price stabilized, I held 65% of the company quietly, invisibly, and well past the threshold that would make the board nervous if they knew. The unintended consequence arrived just as quickly. Sandra texted me late one night, Richard's accelerating the Apex deal. Emergency board meetings. They want to close in weeks, not months. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the sticky notes and lines of string connecting names and numbers across my wall. The decoy had worked almost too well. My shadow company had lit a fire under them, and now the countdown to the real battle had begun. I picked up my pen and drew a red circle around the date of their next meeting, knowing the final moves of this game would have to come sooner than I'd planned. By the 4th week, I could almost taste victory. My war room was nearly all green markers, and my silent army of proxies had pushed my control to 73%. One more significant block of shares, and I would reach the threshold that would make the board powerless. Then the call came. Robert Chen, manager of the St. Matthew's Hospital Pension Fund, spoke with the careful tone of a man already half gone. Elena, I've been thinking. The board reached out. They said you're unstable, acting out of grief. They're offering us a guaranteed premium if we sell to Apex. My committee is leaning that way. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. That fund held 3% enough to break the chain I'd spent weeks building. I tried to keep my voice calm. Robert, if you pull out now, everything my father built will be gone. Apex will bury the research. Patients will pay the price. He hesitated. I need to discuss with the trustees. The line went dead, leaving a hollow ring in my ears. I sank into the driver's seat of my car outside the cafe, hands trembling against the wheel. For the first time since this war began, real fear pressed against my ribs, months of risk, sleepless nights. Every dollar I had one waver, and it could all crumble. Then my phone buzzed again, a name I hadn't seen in years. Frank Morrison, Elena, he said, voice gravelly but warm. I hear you're fighting the good fight. I kept a box your father asked me to hold just in case. It proves Richard's been embezzling from R&D for years, enough to get the SEC's attention. I think your allies will sleep better knowing the enemy is already bleeding. Relief and adrenaline surged through me. With Frank's evidence, the hospital fund had reason to trust me and fear the board. Within 24 hours, Robert called back to reaffirm his commitment. I drove home under the city lights, gripping the wheel tightly, the terror fading into cold determination. My wall of green markers was almost complete, and the next step would take me straight back into the boardroom they had thrown me out of. The elevator hummed softly as it climbed to the 40th floor, each ding a drumbeat in my chest. I wore my father's navy suit, pressed to perfection, and carried the leather briefcase that now held more power than the entire board combined. When the doors opened, the hallway was silent except for the faint echo of my heels on the polished stone. The boardroom doors swung open without resistance. Conversation died instantly. 8 faces turned toward me, some pale, some red with anger, all aware that the woman they'd thrown out like trash had returned on her own terms. Richard Hale rose from my father's old chair. "Security," he barked. "She's trespassing." "Not quite," I said calmly, setting the briefcase on the table. "I have business here, and before you embarrass yourselves, you might want to see this." He smirked and pulled a remote from his pocket. A screen on the wall flickered to life, playing a grainy video of me in a lab corridor, speaking to someone off camera. My voice had been spliced into phrases about selling out and Apex getting everything. It was laughable, but convincing to anyone who didn't know better. "Proof," Richard said, spreading his hands. "She's sabotaging Carter MedTech. I move we remove her shares and pursue legal action." I opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of notarized documents, dropping them onto the table one by one. 80% ownership. I said evenly, verified and filed. And this, I slid out a folder of Frank Morrison's evidence, is proof of embezzlement, insider trading, and your secret deal with Apex. The room erupted in overlapping voices, panic rising like smoke. Richard lunged for the papers, but I pulled them back. Security had already stepped into the doorway. Glancing at me for instruction, I held Richard's gaze, my voice like steel. This meeting isn't about my removal anymore. It's about yours. The brief hush that followed was electric. Every eye in the room waiting for the next move as the walls of their power finally began to crack. The boardroom descended into chaos, a chorus of panic and whispered calculations. Richard's face flushed crimson as he barked orders to no one in particular, but the others were already sliding away from him, the stench of fear overpowering loyalty. Marjorie Quell broke first. Her hands trembled as she reached for the resignation letter my attorney had placed neatly at each seat. She scribbled her name and slid the page across the table toward me. Eyes lowered. I can't go down for this, she muttered. One by one, the others followed. Theo Grant avoided my gaze as he signed, muttering something about fiduciary duty. The sound of pens scratching paper was almost ceremonial, like the last rites of their power. The stack of resignations grew, a silent monument to the betrayal that had brought us all here. Only Richard remained, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles blanched. "You think this is over," he hissed. "You've just doomed this company. You don't know the deals I've made." I met his glare with the same calm I'd worn since stepping into the room. "I know every deal you made, Richard, and the SEC will too. This is over." Security entered, waiting for my signal. I nodded once. The same guards who had marched me out like a criminal now flanked Richard Hale as he sputtered and cursed, his voice echoing down the corridor until the doors shut behind him. Silence settled over the room. I gathered the resignations into a neat stack and placed them in my briefcase. A strange calm washed over me, not gloating, not relief, just the icy satisfaction of balance restored. For the first time since that day, they'd humiliated me. I sat at the head of the table, my father's chair, and let the weight of my reclaimed power settle into my bones as I prepared for the step that would define everything that came next. The boardroom felt different the next morning, lighter, quieter, as if the building itself had exhaled. I signed the documents to transfer 5% of my newly consolidated shares to the St. Matthew's Medical Foundation. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a lock on the company's soul. With the foundation as a permanent shareholder, no future board could ever sell Carter MedTech to the highest bidder. That afternoon, I stood on the small stage of the company's atrium, facing the employees who had once watched me walk out in disgrace. The air hummed with anticipation. Sandra Kim stood at my side, her expression steady and proud. 3 months ago, I began. I was forced out of this company and accused of betrayal. But the only betrayal came from those who wanted to strip away everything Carter MedTech stands for. Today, that ends. And today, we begin again. A ripple of applause moved through the crowd. I announced the new program's expanded compassionate use protocols, partnerships with community clinics, and a commitment to bring immunotherapy trials to underserved areas. Each promise felt like a thread, sewing the company's heart back together. Employees nodded, some smiling, some wiping away quiet tears. For the first time since my father's death, hope filled these halls again. When the building emptied and the echoes of the day faded, I returned to his office, my office now. I opened the bottom drawer of his old mahogany desk and found an envelope, yellowed with age, with my name in his handwriting, "You're ready now." Inside, there was no speech, No instructions, just his old fountain pen and a single line, "Build something that outlives us both." I held the pen in my hand, the weight of his faith settling over me like a warm cloak. The war was over. The legacy was alive. And at last, I was exactly where I was meant to be.